Buluwanaka. I am jumping on this morning to talk about Fijian history. I was wondering why I had thought to do this, but then Dr. Tarisi Vunindilo and I have been talking about running some classes on Fijian history, and we're finally at the time when there's a bit of a lull in teaching for her, and I've got a little bit of clearance in my time. So I think we'll be able to get our first session up, which will be on Lapita pottery in Fiji in the next few weeks. So keep an eye out for that. We'll run a webinar, I think, is the plan at this stage. And so you'll be able to listen into that. And then we're going to keep building and create an online course on Fijian history, because I just feel like that would be a good thing to have for students, teachers, anybody who's interested. So I wanted to also just talk a little bit about Fiji's Methodist history, because that's what I worked on for my PhD. And I've just been thinking a lot about it in the last little while, because I was talking about Papua New Guinean history, and then every now and then my brain goes back to what I did for my PhD. So my work in Fiji was very special to me because my grandma was born there, and I first went there on a bit of an adventure back in 2005. Yes, 2005, to go and see the places where she had spent time growing up. So she was born in Suva, but then when she was about a week old, she was back out to Taveuni. I think that's right. She was very little still, obviously. So her mum and her went back on a boat to Taveuni, and one of the stories she used to tell us was that when they were on their way back to Taveuni, this huge wave came over the boat, and one of the Fijian men on board went in and dived in and saved her. So thank you to whoever that was, because otherwise we wouldn't have had Granny, and she was just so beautiful. So we're very lucky to have her. She was on Taveuni for a little while. She was born in 1921, and her parents had been there since 1918. I think that's right. It's been a while since I got into this. Hey, Al. So then I went over to Lautoka, to Nailanga in particular. That's where she spent most of her time. And then she was in a boarding school in Suva as well while she was a little bit older. And she and her three brothers had these amazing stories of trying to swat hornets with tennis rackets and floating down rivers on logs and getting filthy muddy and getting into all sorts of trouble. And then we would hear stories about her dad going out in his full white mission outfit, because he was a Methodist missionary, and just getting completely filthy, and that got ruined, and her poor mum would have to try and deal with that when he came back from his circuit. And a lot of his circuits when he was at Nailanga and on Taveuni were done on a boat, so he was pretty handy. He was able to build boats and that sort of thing. And then the other thing he apparently had a hand in was looking for gold around Tavua, because he thought that the hills looked a little bit similar to the ones around Ballarat. He was a Ballarat boy. And so he decided to send off some samples for testing, and then a long way down the track, there's the gold mine there at Tavua. So that's the story that I heard. Haven't found any documentary evidence to back that up, but I think he had connections back in Australia and would have been talking to a lot of people that would have been interested in that sort of mining opportunity. So that's that. And then he did a lot of work with the Colonial Sugar Refining Company too. He was part of the Masonic Lodge, like a lot of missionaries were. That seems to be a bit of a touchy subject. And then the other thing I learnt while I was doing my PhD is a lot of missionaries were involved in politics when they shouldn't have been. It was one of the things that they were supposed to stay well out of. But there's so many examples from the Pacific where missionaries were really involved in politics and also in the processes of colonialism. So that's what I ended up looking at for my thesis, was a bit of an interrogation on where the mission sat within the colonial framework and the colonial structures of the society that was changing so rapidly in Fiji. And looking at the kind of business model that the mission used and how that impacted ideas about race and culture, or fed off ideas about race and culture, and then ended up reinforcing a segregated system for the community. So they tried to shape the mission so that it would be what we would call now culturally appropriate. We use that term a lot in the university sector and probably elsewhere as well. That's just where I'm most familiar. And the because when they first got to Fiji in 1835, there were just the Fijians there, and then Tongans in the eastern group too. So the mission originally was established primarily for Fijians, and Methodism was crafted or reconfigured in a way that suited Fijian culture, but with also an expectation that Fijian culture would change to adapt to Methodism and Christianity too, and the kinds of benchmarks for what the missionaries called civilized society. So those are some of the ideas that I looked at. Andrew Thornley's written a lot more about the 1800s. He's the most prolific writer for that time for Fijian Methodist history. So I really looked more from 1900 onwards, because that's around the time that the Indo-Fijian branch was set up, or the Indian branch for Fiji, as it was known at the time. So that's when you can see more concrete divisions coming through, where they're trying to separately organise two branches of the mission, and then there's the European branch of the church as well. So a European version of Methodism, a Fijian version of Methodism, and an Indian version of Methodism. They were all operating together. A lot of the business was separated across those racial lines, the business of the mission. So certain meetings were held independent of each other because they wanted to separate out that business. There were some ways in which it overlapped, and I know Wendy Ratawa, who's based here now, she was really good at reminding me of the fact that people were crossing over these boundaries all the time. So a lot of these are kind of structural boundaries that are in some ways fluid and changing all the time. But then when you keep going back to the mission as a business model, or the mission as a structure, you can see the categories that were set up. So that's what I looked at a lot, and then I looked at the ways in which people challenged it. So, my family was involved in it, not just my great-granddad, with what he was doing with CSR and farmers and stuff around the north, but also his uncle Charles, who the Laline Memorial School is named after. He was there for much longer. He was there for about 40 years, from around, I think it was 1898 he got there. He started off at Nailanga too. His first wife is buried there. And then he went down to Suva and was working more with the leadership, worked at Davuilevu, and then was chairman for a while of the mission. So he was very, very much in that leadership. And there was him and Richard MacDonald, one other person, who were like a band of three musketeers leading the mission for a while too, and in cahoots with each other. And I think his nephew drove him a little bit mad because he was working a bit off the grid and under the radar and doing things that annoyed the colonial administration, and Charles was much more straight-laced about it, and wanting to make sure that it was all by the book and in keeping with the colonial order. Yeah, so one of the famous quotes that I found from, well, famous in my own mind, because I keep remembering it from Charles, was that they needed to rule the chiefs or be ruled in the Fijian branch of the church. So they were navigating those different strains of leadership the whole time, trying to promote talatallers and their authority in community, and then, yeah, finding that was not always easy. Yeah, what else can I say? It changed over time, so it was interesting watching. I mean, they were training Fijian ministers from the 1800s with Indo-Fijians who ended up in the Methodist mission. There were not very many. It was a very small community. There were some standouts who really pushed to be ordained. Ramsay Dioki was one of them, and so I wrote a lot about him and the ways that he tried to challenge the system because he felt like it was the prejudice system that was keeping him down and not allowing him to get that standing as a minister. And then the other person who I wrote a lot about was Sedereki Tuilavoni, who became the first president of the independent Fijian Methodist Church. And he was so interesting. He got educated overseas. He went to the US for some training, and Dioki had been to Australia as well. So there was a big movement around. People were tapping into their networks through the mission to get opportunities, which was great. Tuilavoni was also really active with the World Council of Churches, and then he was, one of the big meetings he went to was in Ghana at around the time of their independence. So he was able to see Kwame Nkrumah and just be in that atmosphere of decolonisation in Africa. So that's something that I think he was able to take back that energy to the Pacific and then push things along. But he was a really good diplomat in the way that he challenged the system through the 1950s and 60s, I think. So that's about all I wanted to say. Just wanted to talk a little bit about what's on my mind. It's so quiet here without the boys. The boys are with their dads. So I am going to try and get some work done today and clean my house and see how it goes. But I hope you all have a good Sunday, get some time to relax, and I will see you next week, no doubt. Bye.